Let me thank the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, our local council, for bringing this program together with Ambassador Neumann. And I'd especially like to give a shout out to Bradley University for hosting our council and for giving us so much support. So with that, let me introduce our speaker tonight. Ambassador Ronald Neumann is currently the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy. He is formerly a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and served 3 times as ambassador to Algeria, Bahrain, and finally to Afghanistan from July 2005 to April 2007. Before Afghanistan, Mr. Neumann, a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, served in Baghdad from February 2004 with the Coalition Provisional Authority and then as Embassy Baghdad's liaison with a multinational command, where he was deeply involved in coordinating the political part of military actions there. Prior to working in Iraq, he was ambassador to Manama, Bahrain, 2001 to 2004, Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Near East Affairs, 1997 to 2000, with responsibility for North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, and ambassador to Algeria, 1994 to 1997. He was director of the Office of North Gulf Affairs, Iraq and Iran, 91 to 94. Earlier in his career, he was Deputy Chief of Mission in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, and in Sana'a in Yemen, Principal Officer in Tabriz, Iran, and Economic Commercial Officer in Dakar, Senegal. His previous Washington assignments include service as Jordan Desk Officer, Assistant in the Middle East, NEA Bureau, and Political Officer in the Office of Southern European Affairs. Ambassador Neumann is the author of a memoir, 3 Embassies, 4 Wars, a personal memoir which was published in 2017, and I can give a personal shout out to its quality, and The Other War, Winning and Losing in Afghanistan, published in 2009, a book on his time in Afghanistan, also a very good read. He has returned to Afghanistan repeatedly and is the author of a number of monographs, articles, and editorials. His writings have focused most heavily on Afghanistan, stabilization, and Bahrain. At the Academy, he has focused particularly on efforts to maintain adequate state and USAID budgets and staffing and upgrade professional formation to enable these institutions to carry out their responsibilities. Ambassador Neumann is on the advisory board of a nonprofit girls' school in Afghanistan, the School of Leadership Afghanistan, or SOLA, and the advisory board of Spirit of America. He is on the board of the Middle East Policy Council and the advisory council of the World Affairs Councils of America. With that, I would like to welcome Ambassador Neumann and turn the microphone over to you, please.
Angela, thank you very much, and thank you to Don, and thank you to the Peoria Council. I'm sorry I'm addressing you this way. We had planned to have me out a little later this month, but as you all know, we're not traveling these days. So I had to give up that idea, but I'm glad I have this opportunity to talk to you anyway. And I was thinking as Angela went through that biography, I really better give her a shorter version, lest we all go to sleep while I'm being introduced. I've told people sometimes the short version of my biography is 3 Embassies, 4 Wars. I was also an infantry officer in Vietnam.
Yeah.
But anyway, let us get on to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is, what should I say? Afghanistan is horribly complex. And if you think I'm going to make this simple, you're probably wrong. But I will try to clarify a few things. What I want to do with you tonight, in a very short compass, is to say a little bit about why we're still there, and then to talk about 4 different pieces of the puzzle. And that is the security situation, the internal politics, the negotiations with the Taliban, which aren't actually happening, and US policy. Because these 4 elements, security, internal politics, US politics, negotiations, they're like the 4 strands of a rope. And you can pull them apart and look at each strand analytically, but a lot of what goes on and a lot of the strength or weakness of the operation is how those 4 strands work together. But let me start with just a couple of words. And I have to tell you, first of all, there are no good choices in Afghanistan. I don't know if there ever were any good choices. We could, that's a separate discussion and probably a long argument. If they are, they were a long time ago. Now there are choices between difficulties. There are choices between bad and worse, depending on, I suppose, how you look at it. But there are no simple good choices, and that drives people crazy because they like, what should we do? A nice simple choice. Well, I can tell you what I think we should do, but it won't be simple. Uh, why are we still there? Or that question really goes down to what happens if we leave without either a stable situation, a war settled, or a peace treaty, which peace treaty is the best outcome. What happens, I think, and you're getting my judgment here, not some celestial truth, but what happens, I believe, is the country gradually unravels and goes back into a civil war. I don't think you necessarily get a clear Taliban victory. There are way too many people who remember living under the Taliban and don't want to do it again and will fight to keep that from happening. But what you are very likely to have happen is a gradual breakdown, an increase of Taliban control of some rural areas, of fragmentation, and a lot of return to warlords and independent armed groups. That, of course, isn't going to do anything for democracy, economic development, or women. But more importantly, from American security interests, what you would get in that kind of civil war setting is lots of room for Al Qaeda to expand in Afghanistan, lots of room for the Islamic State, which is ISIS, which is in Afghanistan, to expand. And it's in that expansion and that feeling of victory over the superpower that you get the greatest dangers, I think, to the homeland and to America, to our allies. And that's why Republican and Democratic administrations, ever since we went in, have said that one condition for peace with the Taliban has to be complete breaking of any ties with Al Qaeda, which, by the way, they haven't quite done. So that is why why we are still in Afghanistan, if you will, is because we really don't like the worst choice of getting out of Afghanistan and having that chaos develop, Al Qaeda expand, the Islamic State expand. We would also like to continue. I say we as though I were still in the government. I'm not. You just have to ignore this kind of professional deformity after 37 years as a Foreign Service officer. I can't quite avoid this sometimes, but I am out of the government. I certainly do not speak for the American government. But this fear of what will happen and the ability to keep it from happening is, as long as we're there with a fairly small presence and combat air support, we can keep that from happening. And we can keep it from happening at fairly low cost. We're not losing a lot of people in Afghanistan. Most of the fighting and dying is done by Afghan soldiers, not by Americans. We lost, I think, 20 people, 22 people last year. We lost 15 the year before, and that is clearly regrettable. And those are real people, real lives. But to put it in some context, we lost 80 in non-combat training incidents outside any theater of war. So the cost is sustainable. Whether one wants to sustain it or not is a political judgment, but it's sustainable. So where are we now? And this leads me to the four subjects that I want to talk about with you. The first is the security situation. Security is not good. It's not disastrous. Taliban have never managed to hold any major city. They three times threatened some provincial cities over past years. The last year, they have not been able to even do that. But there are more areas they dominate than there were, say, when I left Afghanistan in 2007. There are areas that I drove to that I would definitely not drive to today. Particularly of note is what has happened to violence since we signed our agreement with the Taliban. And there's been some pretty good unclassified reporting on that. There was a period called a period of reduction in violence, which was a test to see if the Taliban could actually control their people. And during that period of a little more than a week, the reduction in violence, the violence did go down and way down. And then it went back up again. Taliban are not attacking US forces directly. They are attacking Afghan forces. There are plenty of places. And we are still flying support missions when those attacks get too serious. So the security situation is lousy, but it's not immediately going to fall apart, certainly not as long as our air support is there. The political situation has been a mess. The Afghans finally got themselves around to holding the presidential elections. They were about a year late. That didn't bother me too much. We've accomplished a lot of things in Afghanistan, almost never on the date scheduled. So the fact that something slips in Afghanistan, that's not terribly bothersome. But the election did not go wonderfully well. The population that didn't turn out as well for this election as they have for others. There were a lot of problems. There were some things that went well. The overall fraud was probably less. They're using biometric devices to identify people. But the election was hard. And the Afghan constitution requires that that if you don't have a victory of over 50% in the first round, you have to go for a runoff election. And thank God we don't have that with us, or we'd probably be having lots of candidates and running you get to have even a longer election season. But as it is, there was a dispute then after the election, all kinds of arguments about which ballots should be in, which ballots should be out. At the end of the day, President Ashraf Ghani claimed victory. But he claimed victory on a margin of 50.6%. So with a low turnout, disputed votes, and a 0.06% of over the required vote, he claimed total victory. And his opponent, Dr. Abdullah, and I know both these gentlemen reasonably well, said, no, you don't, can't do that, this isn't good enough. And he decided that he was president. And so they each had an inauguration. Now, this being Afghanistan, that didn't mean you couldn't settle this. So they've been negotiating for several weeks. And actually, I think they're pretty close to an agreement. Talking to Afghan friends and some that are involved with the two gentlemen, I think you will get an agreement. But you don't have a strong government. And even after they split up ministries and decide what they're doing, you won't have a terribly strong government. Although I think there are some positive things you can say. For one thing, you will again have a peaceful transfer of power. And, interesting when you look back and people like to say, well, it's just like Vietnam. Well, remember what we had in Vietnam was the coup that killed Diem and then a rolling succession of coups after that. You never had an election. And you've had now a peaceful transition of power from Karzai to Ghani, and then you will get a peaceful continuation, I think, of power with some sharing after this one, albeit with a lot of political crisis, nevertheless, a peaceful transition of power. So there you have a difficult security situation, but not hopeless. Commandos are pretty good. Afghan army is fighting, and they're losing a lot of people. They're not falling apart. A political situation which it is getting a resolution or getting to a resolution, but one which confuses governance and power and people squabbling over appointments and wanting ministries in order to get patronage. So it's not a strong situation either. And then you have the negotiations. Well, the first thing to understand is that the deal we signed with the Taliban is not a peace negotiation. It's not a peace treaty. It is a commitment for the United States to withdraw troops on a more or less on a fixed schedule. First part, absolutely fixed. Second part with dates, but it's also supposed to be conditions based. The theory of this approach that was negotiated by Ambassador Khalilzad was that since the Taliban said they wouldn't negotiate unless all American troops left, that you had to have a path for the foreigners out, and that suited us too. We want our troops out of Afghanistan. But the deal was that after you get this first half, the first half has two parts. It's our troop withdrawal, and it's supposed to be a break with Al Qaeda. Then you would get the follow on negotiation between the Afghan government people, and the Taliban, are all Afghans after all. Uh, that has not yet really started. The Taliban have consistently refused to negotiate with the Afghan government, saying that the Afghan government is simply our creature, so why negotiate with them? But they came to an agreement they would negotiate with some sort of larger group of Afghan political leaders. And in fact, President Ghani has managed to put together a list of a reasonably small list of people representing all the major political parties in Afghanistan who are ready to negotiate as a body. Taliban has refused to do that, to begin that yet. One of the conditions that was in the final agreement we signed was that the Afghan side, government side, would release 5,000 Taliban prisoners. The Taliban would release 1,000. There was just one little flaw in this agreement. We hadn't quite got this okayed with the Afghan government, and they hold the prisoners. And President Ghani actually thinks this is actually a really lousy idea because holding the Taliban prisoners is one of the major cards he has to play in negotiations. So he's not real keen about, I'm just going to turn them loose, take all the good cards in my hand and throw them on the table first, and then we'll start the game. He doesn't think that's a good idea. I don't know why we said to him that we would have language about best efforts, and then why we signed an agreement with the Taliban that made a guarantee that wasn't ours to keep. But that created a whole second process, and I hope I'm not going into too much detail and confusing you, but this is the main thing that has held up the start of negotiations, in addition to the fact that now nobody's quite sure with COVID-19 if anybody really wants to travel and start talking. But the Afghans and the Taliban have begun a prisoner exchange, very slow, not the most violent people the Taliban would like out of jail first. We are pressing both sides, release more prisoners, hold down the violence, get to talking. But what will you get if you talk? Everybody would like a negotiated solution. There's no question. Everybody agrees. The best ending you could have for this war would be a negotiated peace. All you got to do is get there. There's a little rub in that. So far, I don't think either side is actually quite ready to make major concessions. They each have a vision of what does peace look like. It's actually a very similar vision. It's I'll give you a few bits and pieces of power, a few positions in ministries, and I win. Trouble is that who the I is radically different. So they're at the early stage of a negotiation. I think they will start the negotiation. There are a couple of interesting things to remark about the Taliban. The Taliban do not actually want us to just leave the country. That may come as a surprise. But the Taliban also fear a civil war. They want an orderly transition. They still think they're going to win, but they want an orderly transition to their victory. They don't want us to just pull out and get a civil war. So for those who say that, Neumann and others are too excitable in fearing this civil war, I can only say that our enemies fear exactly the same thing. The second thing is that the Taliban have been quite clear in the negotiations and with academic independence that while they want our troops out, they want us to remain involved in Afghanistan. They want our help in rebuilding the country. They just think they should be governing. So they have incentives not to just break off the negotiation. They want to keep us involved. They don't want to break it off because then our side breaks off too, and we don't have any reason to finish withdrawing our troops. So they they will, in my judgment, get to the start of negotiations. What will you see when you get negotiations finally going? I think you will see a very bumpy process in which you'll have negotiations and you'll have violence, and sometimes you'll get grumpy with each other, and sometimes the violence will flare up, and it'll be an on again, off again thing. There is often an American desire to say, well, you have to stop the fighting so you can talk. Now, that works really well with your kids. Well, if you can get them to stop fighting. Um, it's not actually doesn't have much of a record in international negotiations for settling wars. Because what happens when you stop the fighting? You take all the pressure off people. And once you take the pressure off people, they don't have any really strong reason to make hard choices. Uh, so, in fact, the record, when you look around the world, when you look at places where you stopped the fighting and negotiate and you didn't start again, you tend to have frozen conflicts. Cyprus, Lebanon, uh, wars that have just been on hold for a long time. But that's very unlikely to happen in Afghanistan. If negotiations bog down that way, it's almost certain you would go back to war. So you are likely to have fighting and negotiation going on in parallel. And this will go on for some time until until you reach a situation where both sides decide at the same time that they can't win. And then they will grudgingly find their way to a solution. When you think about negotiations in this way, you're talking, you're fighting, the fighting is the sort of battlefield geometry that puts pressure on the talks. Uh, there are really two key things that are likely to influence this, maybe three, depending on the position of outsiders, which is harder for us to influence. But there are really two that are key. One is the strength of the Afghan government. And right now, it is not as strong as one would like, although it has had a lot of institutional development in 20 years. And the other one is how people judge American policy. Because if the if it looks like we're leaving, the Taliban has less reason to concede anything, and the pressure actually increases on our friends, the Afghan government, to make whatever deal they can quickly because they're going to be in a worse situation later. So, how people read the United States, what they think we're going to do, are we willing to keep putting in at least the minimum level of military support, financial support, that the war won't be lost, becomes um, a terribly important influencer on the Taliban and on both parties. And that's not very, what is the United States going to do? Well, that's not very clear, actually. Um, I know many people will say, and they certainly say it to me, you've been at this for 19 years. Don't you know that it's not possible? And I have to tell them there's nothing we've been doing for 19 years. By my count, we've had 9 different policies in Afghanistan. Washington's problem seems to be that we can't make up our mind and do anything for more than about 2 years. And then we want to change it, rush off in some different direction. And if you don't think that's confusing, look at our domestic policy. Uh, so we keep changing. And with the Trump administration, you've had two rather different policies. The last 2 out of the 9 I described. You had 5, by the way, in the Obama administration. I don't hold any big brief for their period in office for this. But with the Trump administration, you began in 2017 with a declaration that we were not going to be on a timetable anymore. We were going to increase our military aid, and we were going to put pressure on Pakistan, so on. By 2019, what we were doing was making clear we really wanted to get out of Afghanistan quickly. We were back on some kind of a time schedule. We were now asking the Pakistanis, pretty please, will you help us, rather than pressing them hard? And it wasn't clear whether we were going to stay or not. It's still not clear. Secretary State Pompeo, Secretary of Defense Esper have both said that the condition that the withdrawal beyond the first phase is conditional. That if the Taliban are not observing the agreement, if there's too much fighting, we are not necessarily committed to the rest of the withdrawal. I think that's okay, except I don't know what the conditions are that they're looking at, because there is no document that is public that says what the conditions are. Now, some of them, I believe, have actually been spelled out to the Taliban orally, and the Taliban have sort of nodded and said they understand. They haven't really committed. There's some differences there. But publicly, this statement of conditions-based is not very clear. It's particularly unclear because it was the same language that we used in the Obama administration, and it clearly didn't mean a damn thing, pardon me. And from 2013 through 14-15, we kept declaring that our withdrawal was conditions based, and it was very clear to anybody on the ground, and I was back in Afghanistan in those years, that it was not condition based. We were heading for the door, and we would define things as meeting the conditions because that's what suited our purpose. So our resolution and our will are in doubt. And that affects the chances for negotiation. It affects the security situation. As far as I can tell, and I stress that I am not in the government again, you probably figured that out already, but underlie it once more. My best understanding is President Trump really wants two things. He wants to get the troops out of Afghanistan, and he does not want this to lead to a disaster and a Taliban victory and Al Qaeda coming back. The only problem is nobody's figured out a way to have both those things at the same time. And so he pushes, and policy is, if you can imagine two magnetic poles out, no disaster. They pull in different directions. And so policy is fluttering a little bit in between those two poles as it gets pulled back and forth. Now, some of this is canny negotiations, I think. President Trump will demand more than he can have from his own negotiators, and that incentivizes them to, some people will say, no, this is a question of, lack of strategic insight. Others will differ. I don't know the answer. I know that it reminds me a little bit of a story about Henry Kissinger years ago, and I tell it only because Kissinger is a foremost example of a strategist. And the story was that one of his senior people sent him a paper, and Kissinger called him and he said, "Is this the best you can do?" And he said, "Well, let me look at it one more time, Dr. Kissinger." He worked on it, sent it back up. He got the phone call again. "Is this the best you can do?" He said, "Let me work on it one more time." Well, he worked on it one more time, sent it back up. And again, he got the phone call that said, "Is this the best you can do?" And he said, "Dr. Kissinger, really, I think this is the best I can do." And the phone call said, "Then I will read it." So here, in this case, demanding more was simply a pressure tactic to get more out. Didn't mean you didn't have strategic vision. So I can't tell. Is President Trump demanding speed and withdrawal at the rate he is from what he's demanding from his negotiators because this is a careful ploy to get the best deal possible, or is he doing this because he really wants out and he just can't quite find the way and it's strategically incoherent? And in fact, nobody knows, which may undermine the strategy, because the Taliban certainly seems to think that we're leaving, and that's what they're telling everybody. So where are we? We have a war that is going on with minimal American casualties, but with troops committed, and costs real money. But what it costs is about 1.5% of the defense budget. Now that's a lot of dollars. But again, that is a cost that one can perfectly well sustain if you want to. The fact that you're not losing a lot of lives and that you can afford it doesn't tell you whether you should do it or not. It just tells you that it's not impossible to keep doing it if you want to. We have, in my judgment, very serious consequences if we pull out, but we have a very uncertain negotiating process. And some of the potential success of that negotiating process depends on the Afghans getting a little better organized. They're doing some of that. And it depends on our firmness, and we're not very clear. Now, at that point, I don't think I can say I've given you a clear bottom line. And I've hopefully raised your confusion to a higher level of detail. Um, but that's where we are today. That's the situation as best I can describe it to you. So let me stop rambling there with perhaps one comment, because that's an awfully gloomy picture. And one might say, is there nothing positive? Actually, yes, there are some positive things. There's economic potential in Afghanistan, far more than we knew when we went in oil and gas and precious minerals and coal and iron and copper, various other things, even some rare earth. The most positive thing is what's happened in younger Afghans. There's a whole generation of 20 and 30 somethings that has grown up with, albeit in a war situation, with far, far less war than there was for 20 years before, when this education system completely fell apart. And these younger people, and I know a lot of them, they really do want a different country. They're not in power yet. They're getting up to the deputy minister level and heads of departments, but they're not in power yet fully. But they clearly have a different vision. And then there's the very young. As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm on the board of advisors of a small girls' school in Afghanistan. It's a very impressive organization. It takes young girls from all over the country whose parents agree to them coming to Kabul alone to be in this boarding school. It's run by a young Afghan woman, graduate of Middlebury, has raised a lot of money in the States and abroad, and has now gotten land and is building a new campus. Uh, she moved the program from one of sending women to university in America to educating them in Afghanistan, because she said, I don't want to do this just for Afghan women. I want to do it so Afghan women become leaders in the future Afghanistan. And I was out there a couple of years ago having breakfast at the school, and I was sitting at a table with maybe 10 of these young girls from age 7, I suppose, up to maybe 12. And I asked them, what did you want to do when you grow up? And I don't know what kids say in America today. I know in my day, we'd have probably said we wanted to be cowboys or firemen or something. But I asked them, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I went around the table and they said, I want to be a judge. I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to be a member of parliament. I want to join the government. Here are these little girls. One of them probably wasn't more than 3 feet high, speaking fluent English, which they've learned on distance learning in the school program. And they all have this vision of participating in their country uh, in these very solid ways. I don't know if those are the things they'll do in 10 or 15 years when they're grown up, but it gives you a sense of the vision of younger people. And so, having told you about everything that's going wrong and messy, I thought I would leave you with that story at the end of the formal remarks. And now I'm happy to try to deal with questions. And I think Angela is moderating the question session.
I am, and I want to remind everybody to type your questions into the chat. If you're new to Zoom, at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a conversation bubble that says chat. So type a question in there. And as folks are typing a question, I want to ask the first one, and I want to bridge off of what you just commented about young women in Afghanistan. So the COVID-19 has presented a number of challenges to the world community at large. But one of the most concerning for me is the rise in domestic violence. And because people are staying at home, and perhaps those girls aren't allowed to go to school, or no one notices what's going on, they've been called home from school. For the aspirations of young women everywhere across Afghanistan, how do you get more of them into schools like SOLA?
Um, Slowly, one one piece, one step at a time. Uh, there is a huge amount still of domestic violence in Afghanistan, and there is still a lot of violence against women. There are advances. There are certainly a lot of new laws that protect women. The laws are not always well administered, although they are coming into force. Uh, it's a very mixed picture. It's better in the urban areas, it's worse in the rural areas. Um, there is certainly a value on girls' education. That is a change in Afghanistan. In fact, way back 2006, I think, when I was in Afghanistan, I was talking to the governor. I think it was in Host, a nice fellow, was later assassinated. Um, and he told me of a group of tribal elders, Pushtun, very conservative, that had come to see him and said they wanted him to build a girls' school. And he said, well, fine, I really like the idea, but, that's never been where you guys were before. Why do you want this? They said, because our women are sick and we're never going to get doctors to come from outside. So we have to begin the process of educating our women. Um, and so there is clearly a growth in desire for women's education. It's not one thing, and I don't want to exaggerate it, but it is big, and you see it in the determination of students too. There is an American University of Afghanistan. It's a private university uh, with American teachers. It's probably the best university in Afghanistan now. It was attacked 3 years ago. The Taliban breached the wall. They shot at 14 people were killed, including one very well liked Afghan professor who was about to depart the next week for a Rhodes Scholarship. And one of the students who was killed was a young, not killed, but was injured, was a young girl who was crippled. And she lost her crutches and she was crawling up the stairs. And one of these attackers came by and shot her in the leg. And then he came back half an hour later and shot her in the other leg. And it was quite horrible. She was eventually evacuated to the States. She went through various surgeries. What's important is she came back to Afghanistan and she came back to college and she got her degree. Um, every one of the students that survived that came back a year later after the school reopened with better increased security. They came back and they finished their studies and they graduated. Um, and that's the kind of people that will advance things. It won't be all at once, but it's there. There's a lot more girls' education than there was. There is better women maternal child health care, but it's still fragile, and it certainly won't go forward if the Taliban are in power. But although some of it might, but it's so various that it's hard for me to give you a really clear, simple bottom line, because there are places in the country where the Taliban has shut down girls' schools. There are other places where they have allowed girls' schools to continue. And this kind of picture makes it hard. So you can look over this 20-year span, and you can talk about a lot of advance in health, in education, in access to schools. But you also have to talk about all the things that aren't done yet. And so I don't want to only talk about the positives, but if you look at that 20-year span, it's huge.
I'll ask the last one and then I'm going to turn it over. There's some really good ones coming up in the chat box. The $1 billion cut that the Trump administration issued when the president did not want to release the prisoners as part of the deal, arguing that the government of Afghanistan was not playing nice and we cut that $1 billion from their budget. Is that going to have an impact on girls' education, humanitarian efforts, building of schools, that sort of thing?
Only if we really do it, which
Okay.
we have. The threat was made by Secretary Pompeo, went out to try to get Dr. Ghani and Dr. Abdullah to, can't you guys agree? And they didn't agree. And he didn't feel like doing what John Kerry did several years ago and staying out there for weeks and trying to push them into a negotiation. And I think he was right. This time, the Afghans have to own their own solution. But in his disgust to pressure them, he said, if you don't settle this thing, I'm going to cut $1 billion out of the aid. Well, we have not actually done it. To the best of my knowledge, no money has actually been subtracted. And if they come to political agreement, we probably won't. So the short answer is no, it won't hurt. If we actually cut it, it will hurt everything, but it will particularly hurt the military because we don't have $1 billion in non-military support in Afghanistan. And so most of that money would have to come out of the Afghan army. So assuming you want the army to continue fighting so we don't either lose or have to do it ourselves, then taking the money out of the Afghan army is probably kind of shooting yourself in at least the foot. If you'll pardon me just for a little riff on this question, because it gets to something that is really hard, as if I hadn't talked to you about enough things that are really hard in Afghanistan. But one of the hardest ones is this: people will say, you give them all this money, but damn it, why can't you just tell them what to do? And one of the problems with this kind of pressure is that when you cut money, you put pressure on the state. But the problems usually are not problems of the state. They're problems of political advantage, people fighting for power for personal reasons or for the political party of their choice, but not for the state. So your pressure falls on the state, but it doesn't directly bring pain where you're trying to bring it. In this case, you've got Dr. Ghani and Dr. Abdullah fighting about who's going to be president. If you cut money to the state, someday after one of them's in charge, that will hurt, but it won't hurt them immediately. And so it's frustrating because we give a lot of money, but it's very hard to turn that money into pressure that is useful. It's particularly hard, of course, because of the whole way we give money and put it into contracts, and we make it pretty hard for ourselves anyway. But at the end of the day, the problem is the pressures on the state, and the place you need pain is on an individual or several individuals. And so it's like trying to get your pry bar to work around a corner. You just lose a lot of leverage.
Very good. That might tie into Shelley's question here. Says, you said there are no good choices. What's the best worst choice for the future?
I think the best worst choice is, until you get successful negotiations, is that you scale it down probably a little bit more to what you need to sustain for a very long time, and make it clear that that's what you're doing. It's not that your cut is not the first step out the door. It is, if you will, right sizing the mission to what we're prepared to sustain for a very long time, and to make that case to the American public, and to be frank about it. What you get now, in a way, is the worst of both worlds. You keep looking like you want to get out the door, but you don't leave. Some of you may have had guests like that. So, but the problem with that is you don't get the pressure and the psychological boost of people being convinced you're staying, but you're not getting out either. So if you don't want to run, which I don't, obviously, and I've had skin in the policy game, and you have to take that into account in evaluating what I say to you. But if you think it is a bad idea to lose, and you don't have a clear way of winning, then you need to get this down to a level that you can sustain for a long period of time, and make clear that you're prepared to do it. And frankly, I think we can do that. We're pretty close to that. The first troop reduction is not going to push us below that level. I've talked to General Miller about this. He was fairly comfortable about these kind of numbers quite some time back. The Afghans are doing most of the fighting. What they need is the air support, the financial support, and some training. Uh, you can do that at a cost that we can afford. There is not right now a whole lot of political pressure to get out. President Trump clearly wants out for his own reasons, but it's not a big issue in Congress. It's not being heavily debated. Uh, so you could do it. That is a really hard choice. We're going to stay in this messy thing for an indefinite period uh, to keep worse things from happening. That is my definition of the best worst choice, or the least bad of the bad ones.
Very good. How is the press like? What's the status of the press in Afghanistan?
In Afghanistan, oh, it's a vibrant press. A lot of journals, a lot of television stations, uh, television, which you can, by the way, if you're interested in the Afghan press, if you look up Tolo, Tolo News, which is one of the leading media groups in Afghanistan, they have their own English feed. But you have radio stations and television stations, newspapers, and they are all busily attacking everybody. Um, and unfortunately, you've had quite a high number of journalists killed in Afghanistan, including a lot of Afghan journalists uh, doing their job. But there's some quite remarkably good reporting. There are also Afghan journalists um, and Afghans working for sort of scholarly publications. There's something called the Afghan Analysts Network. That's in English. That is it's not quite right to call it academic. It's more like a think tank that does a lot of work on Afghanistan, and their stuff is outstanding. And they have, for instance, they recently published two reports on the violence, what's going on. And they had Afghan reporters who were interviewing people in provinces all across Afghanistan. So it was not just about the statistics, but about the differences in the fighting in one place and another. So you also had the Afghan government sometimes pressing on the press when they get too frustrated. And you get a lot of pushback from the press and others about that. So it's a good, strong liberal in the sense of free press, uh, and that's certainly one of the positive developments.
It does seem positive. Thank you. Um, Another question comes from Barbara. She says, and it ties in with one I was going to ask as well, the bigger issue seems to be Pakistan. So let me give it a frame a little bit. Afghanistan's located in a very interesting neighborhood with neighbors like Iran, Pakistan, and China. Then, of course, you've got the smaller Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. Did I miss one? It's a tough neighborhood, we'll say. But Pakistan in particular is a country that we in the United States pay attention to. And of course, what kind of support can we expect them to actually give Afghanistan? What do we want them to do there? Or do we want them not to do anything there and stay out?
They will definitely not stay out. Um, Pakistan has been a real problem in this. Taliban has found sanctuary. Uh, Pakistan has been a little bit on both sides. There is a Pakistani Taliban which broke away from the main Taliban. They're actually at war with the Pakistani state. But the Taliban that we worry about still has sanctuary. All their leadership is in Pakistan, where we can't bomb them. It's very frustrating. Now, the Pakistanis have given support to the peace process. They have put some pressure on the Taliban to come to the table. I do not see that they have put any pressure on the Taliban to do any particular thing at the table, but they have pressed them to get there. Uh, they're still a major problem. I think they're not all problem. There's some support as well, and we thank them publicly for their support. But they still play both ends against the middle. And we have there's another problem. People want to press Pakistan. We do that periodically, and then we give up on it, and we do it again. After we've done that routine for 40 years, they don't necessarily believe it when we press them. but we always have the problem. We don't want the Pakistani state to fall apart. It has nuclear weapons. We don't want loose nukes uh, getting into the wrong hands. And we don't want another Indo-Pak war that could come with a failing Pakistani state. So there are real limits on how much you can press them. Uh, so they are a problem. They are a little bit less of a problem or more help than they used to be. And they do, I think, want a peace settlement, but they want one in which people they like are going to have enough power. Uh, they also have a view that they have a strategic danger. India will get into Afghanistan. This is their strategic depth. They will be threatened from there. And Pakistan and Afghanistan have had bad relations since the founding of the Pakistani state. So it's not new. It's not all on the Pakistani side. They're pretty paranoid about this, but even paranoids have real enemies. So they they have to deal with it. I could go on for a long time, but we don't have a long time, so I'll stop there.
Oh, well, are there other Middle Eastern countries that play an influencing role on internal politics of
Oh,
Afghanistan?
everybody plays. Well, not everybody. The Russians and the Iranians have, which were both countries were actually helpful to us when we went into Afghanistan for quite some time. They're now warming up their relations with the Taliban. They're warming their relations with the Taliban because they think we're going to leave and they're going to deal with the Islamic State, and that's a bigger threat to them than the Taliban. So they will warm up their relations with the Taliban. Um, that's one of the problems. The Chinese are interested because they have Uyghur insurgents who find refuge in Afghanistan, and they worry that that will get bigger. One of the things that I think you would see if the country falls apart and goes into civil war is that all kinds of outside players will come in to support different people. Pakistanis will go back to supporting the Taliban. The Iranians may support the Taliban, but they'll also support the Shia political parties. The Russians will support people, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks. None of them will support anybody enough to win. They will, that's our thing. We want a vision of the end. They will support in order not to lose. They will support that their friends don't lose, that their borders aren't menaced. But that's the recipe for the Civil War to expand and just go on and on and on.
Okay. Um, that one of the earlier questions was about Charlie Wilson's war, and
Mhm.
that deals with Russia. There had been reports last year that Russia was already poking its fingers in and supporting certain groups, perhaps even the Taliban.
No,
Um,
they are supporting. I mean, they are dealing with the Taliban. They are quite public about dealing with the Taliban. Russians have told me they're dealing with the Taliban. They claim that they are not arming them, that they are dealing with them politically, partly because they want peace. And that probably is true up to a point. One of Putin's issues is that Russia wants to be a great power again, or is a great power, and so they see themselves being involved. They are also um, giving. They probably are giving a little bit to the Taliban. They're certainly dealing with them politically. They're public about that. They are. They may well be giving them some material support, but it's not a ton.
okay. And Qatar is hosting a lot of the negotiations, the Taliban leaders in particular, because nobody else wants them to come to their country. But does that location of negotiations, how does that play with the United States attending the negotiations without alienating the Saudis,
Oh, I think
Qatar and Saudi Arabia?
that's well enough established that's has fortunately not. I mean, it began long before the Saudis and the Qataris came to their latest falling out, and they've had falling outs before. I spent a lot of time in the Gulf, but it began before their latest problems, and it doesn't seem to have been affected by them. So I
Okay.
think the location is okay, although there have been discussions about having the negotiations, if they really get started, move, for instance, to Norway. Norway's been very involved in various kinds of peacemaking efforts, although they've been very supportive to us, and they're a NATO member. They've had troops in Afghanistan, but they've had a lot of dealings with the Taliban, not in ways we object to, but politically trying to broker settlement. So there is some possibility that negotiations could move to Norway. They could stay in Doha if you can get them started at all. They could even, bounce back and forth between both places, but it's not a problem.
Very good. The last question is about the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, China's Belt and Road Initiative. Do you think, or what do you know about its plans, China's plans for that Belt and Road to go through Afghanistan? In that regard, what kind of ambitions does China have on Afghanistan?
China is putting a lot into Pakistan and in the port of Gwadar, which is sort of up toward the north part of the Pakistani coast. And that is to be part of a link that would go indeed through Afghanistan. And the Chinese have a big copper contract, $9 billion, $9 billion with a B, to develop copper in Afghanistan, except they haven't actually done anything. They've had the contract now for a number of years and they haven't done anything about it. The Chinese are concerned about Afghanistan, but their primary relationships are with Pakistan. So they've become more vocal about supporting peace, but they're clearly not going to use their relations with Pakistan to put any heavy pressure on. They would be involved economically if there is peace, and they would have part of the Belt and Road Initiative going through there. I don't see that as particularly menacing from the Afghan point of view. Pakistanis may find themselves with a debt trap, I don't know. But overall, among all the problems we have in Afghanistan, I'm not terribly worried about that one.
Okay, very good. But before I wrap it up here, we have hit 7 o'clock. Before I want to wrap it up, I want to ask you, is that the best you can do?
Well,
Any last minute comments?
All I can say is you'll just have to bring me back and I'll try harder.
Then I will read it. All right. With that, I would like to thank you all for joining us for this. I believe it's the last session of nope, there's one more tomorrow, cooking a Hispanic delicious dessert. But tonight is the last one of
appetizing than my subject.
a lot sweeter. There you go. But thank you for attending for this C by C Amplified. And again, you can find recordings and wrap-ups of all of these sessions at C by C Amplified, which is spelled CXCamplified.com. And again, thank the World Affairs Councils of America and thank the Peoria Area World Affairs Council for this last session. And by all means, go to your local World Affairs Council and join today. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Ambassador Neumann. As always, this is always an exciting and very interesting program.
Thanks very much, Evelyn. Thanks very much, Angela. Thank you for having me, and thanks to the Peoria Council. And I do hope to get back to Peoria one of these days.
Terrific. We look forward to it. Good night.